So in this video, I'm going to be talking about velocities, MIDI mapping, the MIDI grooves. There are MIDI grooves included in this pack. If you click on the grooves tab, you can import the ones that come with it. There's various different presets for the MIDI mapping, and you can customize this and edit it yourself as well. I've done a full video on the Middleton channel on how to route this through your DAW, so check that out if you want to do that. I don't bother doing that, but if you want to, go check that video out and I'll show you how, and a few techniques that may vary from ones you might have seen in the past. So in terms of the velocities, this kit is intended to be programmed at the highest velocities. And this is coming from someone who does professional mixing work. And the main reason I wanted to start this project in the first place was so I had drum samples to utilize in my own mixes and to make my mixing really convenient. And I also need to remind people that this is a pre-processed library as opposed to a less or unprocessed drum library. And because of these two different types of drum libraries you get, processed and or not so processed, there may be some reasons why you might get different velocity layers in different drum sample packs. But as I said, these drums, either in MIDI form or the Slate trigger TCI files, were intended from the start to be utilized in my mixes. So there are various reasons why this kit is intended to be programmed at the highest velocities, and I'll cover all those aspects. Basically, all the drum libraries I love, have utilized up to this point, have all been libraries where 127 is sort of the default, and you can just program stuff at that velocity and it sounds great and ready to go. And I'll explain to you guys why this is my preference and why I think this should be just industry standard. But before I get into this, I just want to stress there are a ton of different velocity layers, especially for snares. You can get very realistic, really dynamic rolls. And the way this library is designed, you'll never hear the same sample in succession, so you won't get that machine gun-like artificial sound. I also want to stress that this drum library does have really hard hits played by a really powerful drummer, and you can hear how powerful these drums sounds on all the demos I've done so far, all the demos on the Middleton website. But for myself and all of the producers that I look up to, I hate the sound of snares being hit as hard as physically possible. The moment you go past like a really good, solid, powerful sounding rim shot and go for a hit that is as hard as you can hit the snare turns into more of like a blip, and you get this really big transient spike, ton of upper mid-range, and barely any body to the sound. And I'm talking mainly on the close mic here. So what you may hear in some other drum libraries at 127, the highest velocity, is a snare hit that goes beyond what I would want to utilize in a mix. If I'm recording a real drummer, or I've been sent files to mix, and either the drummer goes into a slow section and they really lay into the snare, at least on one hit, or they just do the whole section, my EQ and compression that I've set for, the consistency of a good, powerful player, if they start to hit way harder, that consistency, compression, and EQ is going to need to change. And obviously with real drum performances, you're going to get those inconsistencies. But when you hit a snare that hard, the drum starts to choke, it doesn't sing, it doesn't have that nice crack, but even like low end to high end ratio. And that's why in my mixes or when I'm programming drums, I have no need for snare hits that are that loud. So it's kind of like Spinal Tap. When you have these amps go to 11, why don't you just make 10 louder? Why don't you just make 127 a usable velocity range instead of bringing everything down? And when you're writing and you're in the zone and you just want to program your ideas and get them out quickly, it will be at 127 and it's going to sound great. So what you hear in Ultimate Heavy Drums at the hardest velocity is a really hard rim shot, a really powerful one, but it's the type of rim shot that a drummer would be able to maintain for at least heavy sections. And then you've got some other layers that you can use, like back off slightly if you want to go for like fast thrash beats, bring it down a little bit maybe. But this was all about creating realistic drum sounds that were going to serve a purpose. So if the drummer could hit the snare even harder than the samples we recorded, although that might be covering the entire spectrum of what's humanly possible, for me as someone that does professional mixing, I just have no need or purpose for drum samples that hit that hard. You don't get the same fatness and sustain, you just get a really kind of tight blip of a sound. And what I think is really important to mention here, if you EQ your snare drum for the hardest possible hits that are that hard have barely any low end and have a ton of upper mids. So you're going to want to scoop out some upper mids, you're going to want to add tons of low end. The problem with this is all your more dynamic, softer snare hits, which are typically always going to have more low end to high end up sounding incredibly muddy. And you hear that in a ton of modern day mixes where people are using 127 as hard as physically possible snare hits for their mix. And then when a fast dynamic snare roll comes in, you hear a really, really muddy, thuddy snare sound. Even ghost notes are sounding way too muffled and fat. And it doesn't really sound realistic in terms of, the processing that you would want to have with a more even, well-rounded snare sound. So again, I'll just mention this is why there's a difference between a pre-processed drum library like this one where the snares have been compressed versus a drum sample library where maybe the snares have been slightly EQ'd but they're still a bit more raw and need more processing. So the whole purpose of this drum sample library was to capture really good, solid, hard-hitting hits, but the type of hits that are actually physically maintainable for a drummer to play throughout a song, or at least through heavy sections, and maybe bring the velocity down a little bit for faster stuff, but just to save you the headache of messing around with velocities. And you can keep most of your beats at 127. I do, especially for kick and the snare, and maybe the crashes, and it's just way easier when you're writing and want to get your ideas out as quickly as possible. So for me personally, all my favorite producers that I think make the best metal mixes, people like Andy Sneap, Colin Richardson, Scott Atkins, more recently Chris Clancy, or even people like CLA, typically use snare samples that are quite hard hitting, but they also bring in compression to add a bit more aggression and be able to control that aggression with compression. And a lot of those guys use one-shot samples blended in with the real snare to kind of even things out. But the whole purpose of this library is because we're working with programmed drums, you can have a more evened out snare sound because you're programming it and you can control the velocity layers for each section more so than a drummer who's having to physically maintain a certain type of hit throughout a song. I know certainly that Andy Sneap hates super hard snare hits, and some of you might have seen Scott Atkins nail the mix recently where he said, I think 127 velocity should be banned. But there's obviously different approaches to this kind of stuff, and as I said, part of this is making your life more convenient when you're writing and programming drums. So just to reiterate, there are very, very hard, powerful hits in this library, but we haven't gone up to what I would consider an unusable layer of attack on the snare. When you try and set your EQ and compression for a more consistent and more obtainable level of hitting throughout a song, those hits are just gonna throw things out of whack. And even if you've recorded real drums and a drummer just wants to do a super powerful like snare flam to lead into a section, even in those instances, in a real mix, if a drummer has done like just a massive snare flam at the start of the song and it is as physically hard as they can, I will go in and replace that with a slightly softer hit because it will sound fatter. So the starting point of Ultimate Heavy Drums was not actually the contact instrument, it was having a collection of TCI sample files that I could use in my mixes. And anyone that uses Slate Trigger, and I'm going to do more videos on that coming up, anyone that uses Trigger knows that firing off 127 velocity is the easiest thing to set your threshold for, and having that as a very usable velocity to use makes your life a lot easier when you are mixing. So as I've already said, aside from the fact that I don't like pointlessly aggressive snare hits in drum sample libraries, the main thing for me is all my favorite libraries, so including some of the Tune Track stuff, even like the GGD One Kit Wonder Architects, where you could just program at 127. As someone who writes music and just being able to program things and not worry about your velocity layers, initially anyway, makes your life so much easier, and it's so more pleasing just to hear drum sounds that sound great as you click them in, and you don't need to worry about, oh, where's the perfect velocity range for this snare or this cymbal. That being said, I really want to emulate very realistic drum performances with this plugin, but utilizing the highest velocities as standard means you can easily back stuff down for more dynamic snare rolls or really fast tom rolls where it might sound just a bit too artificial if you leave everything at 127. Another thing, if you've already got tons of MIDI that you've programmed at lower velocities, in most DAWs like Cubase, you can highlight all of your MIDI and just drag it up. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem to adjust any existing MIDI. And I'm going to show you in this video how I go about programming realistic drums with this sample library. But as I said, there are MIDI grooves included with the library. If you go in the Grooves tab and open up the folders of the core patterns, you can open these up and have a look for yourself and see how I've gone about programming these things. And, you know, backing off the velocities for like fast thrash beats on the snare, having some accented hits on the hi-hats for those fast beats, all that kind of stuff. So to recap, the main three reasons why I think 127 should just be industry standard again. It makes it way easier when you're writing, when you just want to get your ideas down quickly. If you're using the Slate Trigger TCI files, setting your threshold for the maximum amount is the easiest way to set your threshold, and then you can obviously adjust things and bring hits down for more dynamic snare rolls, that kind of thing. And lastly, I have no use for drum samples where the snare has been hit as hard as physically possible. So there's no point for me including those layers in this library, because I just want this to be headache free, really easy to use, and not have anything that I would remove from a real professional mix. So to talk about some of the different velocity layers with snare drums, there's usually 6 to 7 layers. So starting at the highest velocity, between 127 and 100, you've got either 2 or 3 layers of good solid rim shots, and then it goes all the way down to ghost notes. And you can program very realistic snare rolls with all of these various velocities. And as I said, as someone that wanted to utilize these samples for my own mixes, I just wanted to be able to completely replace like a snare drum that had been recorded poorly with one of my own samples, and just know that it's going to be able to replicate all those articulations of a real drummer. For the kicks, there's usually 5 velocity layers, and for toms, I think it's more like 5 to 6 velocity layers depending on the piece of the kit and what sort of articulations are really needed. For me personally, because I work with metal, and most metal is like, you know, a one-shot trigger kind of drum sound, and that's what I kind of like the sound of, I never go below 127. It's rare that I find a need for lower velocities, but having 5 layers for your kicks and your toms, 5 to 6 layers, still means you can have very realistic, very dynamic kick and tom fills and that kind of stuff. So for all the demos that you've heard so far from me, nearly everything has been programmed at 127. So if it's a big like stompy section on a Crash or a China, everything will be at 127, and it's a usable velocity range that just sounds like a really consistent, solid drummer. And then for things like blast beats, I'll bring the snare down so it's less than a rim shot if it's like a traditional Euro blast. If it's like a thrash beat, I'll bring the snare down, not at the highest velocity, but still a rim shot, just a little bit lesser than the hardest velocity because it sounds a bit more natural. And I'll show you some really realistic and dynamic snare rolls coming up in this video. So doing different MIDI libraries is definitely going to be something you're going to see a lot more of from Middleton. But as I said, there are MIDI grooves included with the pack. You just click on the Grooves tab, open up the chord patterns, and there's a bunch of different grooves to choose from, and it'll say next to each one the ideal BPM for that specific groove. Also with the mapping, there's various different mappings included as different presets in the mappings tab to emulate other drum sample libraries, but it's also fully customizable and you can save your own. And if you want to adjust anything, that's really easy to do, and you just do that on the mappings tab. Okay, so I've got a project loaded up here. This is the Middleton launch demo, one that you guys might have heard already. And the purpose of this intro was to kind of create just like the sound of a drummer just messing around in the studio before a song starts. And yeah, I feel like we've got some really realistic, really dynamic snare rolls here. And I'm going to show you how I've gone about programming these drums in the velocity layers I'm using. So as I said, typically I just program in everything at 127. That's the most convenient thing to do. So anything that's kind of like fast and stompy, in particular, stuff like this. Kick and snare are at the hardest velocities. And the snare sounds like this. Kick sounds like this. It's a very hard hit, but it's also something that is obtainable for a really good solid drummer to do throughout a song and have a consistent snare sound. And you'll see here with the ride, this is like a quite relatively fast 8th note thing on the ride, a bit of a groove. So we've got, these are sort of more accented, so every other 8th note is at a slightly lower velocity, not using the hardest velocities for this section, just so it sounds a bit more realistic. But if I wanted to just, when I was writing, just program everything at 127, it would still sound okay. It just doesn't really groove like a real drummer would play it, so I've just undone that. And it's good practice to try and get into the habit of looking at real drummers, how they play, and see the sort of like bounce they do when they're doing these sort of sections. You can sort of see which hits are more accented and that kind of thing. Got a dynamic snare roll going into this section. So as I said, rim shots start from 100 and up usually. So we've got fat hits, and then you just get a bit more of that pop sound to the snare as soon as you get past 100. So for anything that kind of like builds or is quite fast, I typically go less than 100. And yeah, got a little bit of an accent there. So it's really easy if I wanted to just program this in from scratch to show you how I go about doing it. Do everything at 127 to begin with. As I said, you'll never hear the same sample in succession. So that's how it sounds at 127. Again, it doesn't sound robotic, but it could definitely have a bit more vibe to it. So I'm going to bring down this hit like I did previously. And yeah, it's usually good to have like the harder hits on like the 1, be harder than sometimes the follow-up hits, just to get a bit more of that sort of realistic groove. I might actually bring this one down to a slightly quieter rim shot, and then, as I said, bring these snares down so they're not rim shots, and have that as like an inductory rim shot. Cool. So for things like crashes and chinas, if I was doing just like a big section like all of this stuff, 127. This section here, like a breakdown, all at 127. It's not needlessly hard hitting. And I might have gone in and accented some of these crashes here. Now I'm going to do a lot more videos on how to program realistic drums, especially if you're not a drummer, but doing things like making sure if you've got like snare and tom hits falling on the same beat, just to kind of like naturally flam them. Sometimes you don't want to go like too overboard, but making sure that they're not all exactly lined up on the grid always sounds a bit more realistic. You could like even flam it a bit more by making this one a bit later. Then I'm going to show you this thrash beat. So here again, kicks are all at 127. I've gone in for some more dynamics on these kicks here for the fast bit. And what I've done, I programmed this all in at 127, and I literally just highlighted all these snare hits and brought them down to a lower velocity for still rim shots, still hard hits, but just not the hardest ones, because it just sounds a bit better for the fast stuff. And you can play around with different snares. They're going to be processed differently. It's always good to just try these things out for yourself and see how they sound. If you wanted to, you could just keep it at 127, and I'll show you that now. You definitely will hear a lot of mixes in metal that have that sort of sound, and the whole point is to sound really consistent and punchy, so I wouldn't have a problem with that. For the hi-hats, for a thrash beat, I've definitely brought the hi-hats down, so they're not at the hardest velocity on the harder hits, and it's pretty common to have a bit of a bounce to a drummer's right hand when you're doing a thrash beat, so it's better practice to put the harder accented hit on the snare as opposed to the kick drum when you're looking at these eighth notes, because if you do like more pronounced hats on the kick drum, like it just sounds like a hoedown. It's not like a proper thrash beat. Like proper thrash is like consistent doubles on your right hand. And if you go up to a tempo of like 260, like really fast, it just sounds better if you're just going to do a singular hit on the hi-hats to do it on the snares. And then we can look at this really dynamic snare roll here. So I've gone in and put in some accents, so it's like da 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 da. So I've done all those notes as, I didn't click on that one properly, as rim shots, and then quieter, softer hits in between to really hear the accents. And I've gone in and just moved stuff slightly out of time. I've definitely been sent MIDI before, or MIDI drums, where people have gone a bit overboard with making stuff out of time. It's good to add a bit of human realism, or try and replicate that if you can with your drum programming. But you don't need to go overboard, so don't pull things too out of time, because it just starts to sound bad. And then it just sounds like a drummer's played badly on a MIDI kit. And it's also worth thinking about what is physically possible when you're programming drums, because the amount of times I've been sent like 2 crashes and a snare and a kick all at the same time, and you would need 3 arms to do that. So yeah, definitely be mindful of what is physically, humanly possible for a drummer to play. One thing I'll talk about here for this sort of like quote-unquote drum fill, sort of drum solo at the start, I've put the kicks on the intro here on the left kick, and there's a ton more room mic, as you'll hear, and overhead mic, just to give it a bit more like of a vibey drummer playing in a room sound, and then switching to the right kick when these cymbal chokes come in. And as I mentioned earlier at the start of this video, talking about, you know, if a drummer hits like a super hard snare flam at the start of the song and they hit like hard as physically possible, I would go in and replace it with softer hits that sound fatter. So these hits here, even though it's meant to be a really impactful flam before the song kicks in, let's listen to it again. I've brought them down so they're not even at the hardest velocity, but it's a snare flam and it sounds fat, it's been compressed, and I could put it up to 127 and maybe it would sound more powerful, but I wanted it to sound, you know, thick at the same time. Okay, so next I'm going to show you the MIDI Grooves tab. So if you click here down on Grooves, Ultimate Heavy Drums, Core Patterns, bunch of different MIDI grooves included with the library just as a good starting point. This one, Extreme Metal, 218 BPM. Obviously that is the ideal sort of tempo for the drums that have been programmed, and we can just click on that. Cool. Then if you wanted to change the mapping, you can go into the mapping section here, and then MIDI preset. Ultimate Heavy Drums is this, what it comes as standard, which is quite similar to some of the libraries I've used in the past. There's a tune track one, get good drums mapping, then you can just kind of adjust any of those as you wish and export or import different ones. You can quite easily change all of these to be completely customizable. You can change the velocity curve by clicking on this section here, and you can do that for each different part of the kit. So for the kicks, snares and so on, and the different velocity layers will respond differently depending on how you move the curve on these, and you can change it so, you know, cymbal curves are different to snare curves, for example. Now I've loaded up Slate Trigger. I'm going to show you how to set these thresholds and how I utilize these in my drum mixes. I'll do a full video on this soon, but this is how it sounds feeding real drums into Slate Trigger. It's way easier to utilize like 127 as default velocity, and then if you wanted to go and sort of bring the velocity of the snares down, or the level that you're feeding into trigger, by simply editing the level of the audio that you're sending in. So I could, if I wanted to trigger off slightly quieter hits, I could take this bit of snare in this bit of verse and bring the audio down that's being fed into trigger to trigger less hard hits. And you can sort of go in, because obviously we're working with real drums here. Some of these hits, it's very, very consistent playing, but some of them, you know, just because of the nature of how real snares sound, will feed in slightly different velocity ranges, so you can go in and sort of even that stuff out later. But I'm going to do a full video on how to utilize Slate Trigger files for your real drum mixes very soon.